Good day and welcome to the second session that I'm doing at the Excelsus Lent Conferentie 2020. It's great to be back with you. Thank you for some of the feedback that you gave to me after Monday's session as we looked at the world during and after COVID. In this session today, we're going to focus in on the church. What might be the lasting legacy of the COVID crisis on the church as we see it? And here I want to ask you to go along with me in what really ideally should be a conversation. It would be magnificent, wouldn't it be, if we could all just sit around in a circle and have a conversation. There's some words you can't translate. We need a kuier to talk about this kind of stuff, don't we? Because there are no simple answers. There's no magic formula for what the church is going to be like, what we need to do to come out the other side of this COVID crisis and be healthy churches. And I think a lot of us are struggling to see what might happen. I am deeply concerned that many churches are going to struggle and not even survive through this COVID crisis. So thank you for joining me for the session, and I hope that you will understand a very different style from my first session. My first session was more of a presentation I've done regularly for my corporate clients, and I tried to adjust it for the church environment. But in this talk, I want to speak more from my heart. I'm not a church consultant. At one level, I'm not even a theologian. Yes, I am theologically trained. Yes, I was an ordained pastor. Yes, I grew up in the church. Yes, I have a passion for the church. I have not given up on the church. I believe that it is God's vehicle for delivering His kingdom into the world. And I believe we have to make church work. I believe church will work. But I also believe that church is reconstituted every now and again in history. That was what the Reformation was for. Possibly you could even say that was what Constantine was for. Every few centuries, the church goes through a shift and a change. And it gets revitalized, it gets re-energized, it gets reformed. And I think that COVID is going to be part of the next reformation, the next reformation of the church. Because I think, just like we spoke about with businesses, that disruptions were already in the system before COVID came, I believe disruptions have already been in the church system for quite a long time. Church attendance, church membership, and giving to churches has been on a constant decline for the last few decades. And this is true almost all around the world. Yes, there are some places in the world that have seen many revivals and growth in the church, but in most spaces, and certainly in spaces where church has become part of middle-class society, we have basically been seeing the decline of church in whatever metric you really want to measure, from finances to the number of missionaries sent out, from the number of new young people joining the church to the number of conversions. And most churches are getting older and older as the people who are the faithful people are people who have been coming to church for 50 or 60 years. And it's time now for a revitalization. And that's where I think we are. You know, people who are saying, I am missing church and I'm desperate to get back to church. Let's think about what they are in fact actually missing. They're missing singing together. They're missing connecting with their friends. They're missing the fellowship of being at a space. Maybe they're missing the comfort and familiarity of a building. In English, the space we call the sanctuary, the safe place. And they're missing a space to take their children to. Youth group activities, children's church, Sunday school, where their children both have Christian activities and Christian and friendship and engagement, and also get taught the scriptures. But all of those things sound like a country club. All of those things sound like it's just for us. We are missing our stuff. Are people really missing what church does for others? As far as I'm concerned, church is supposed to be the only club in the world that is constituted for the benefit of its non-members. It's meant to be an entirely outward-looking institution that is aimed at taking the gospel out to the world. It's just a base to get out into the world. And yet, the things we are missing are all the things that we get from the church. I think a lot of people have been playing church for a long time. And I think a lot of people are going to have this gap from church and are going to realize they were just playing. They're going to realize that they're enjoying their weekends much more without all of that. They also, let's be honest, going to remember that a lot of what takes place in our churches is conflict between people, petty politics, people going backwards and forwards with each other at church. Yeah, that happens, right? All the time it happens. And people are not missing that. And I think that if we only focus on asking how do we get back to what we had, I think we're missing the most beautiful opportunity that we have in our lifetimes to both reimagine what church could be and revive what our churches are supposed to be. So that's where I'm coming from in this conversation. And let me just give you 4 context points, and then I want to get into some practical things for us to think about. I want to talk about the purpose of the church, I want to talk about the practice of the church, and I want to talk about the theology of the church as my 3 big themes. But 4 context points that might be useful to you, because I'm sure I'm going to rub some of you up the wrong way, and I'm sure some of you are not going to appreciate my approach and my thinking. So we might as well be honest with each other and just say where I'm coming from. Then at least you know on what basis you can reject 1 or 2 of the things I might say. The first is I'm not really here to help you to open your church after lockdown and to work out, how do you put hygiene practices in place and when is it safe to go back to the building and so on. That's not my thought at all. I'm wanting us to think about 3, 4, 5 years from now, after we've dealt with the immediate effects of COVID, what might be that lasting legacy, that shift in mindset, that shift in society? So the second point is that I believe that the church is in desperate need of reform and has been for a long time. As much as I am deeply committed to church as God's chosen vehicle, which is my third point, I believe that church cannot continue the way that it has been, and that we are at a moment where history is catching up with us, and we need to fix a really broken institution. And the fourth point then is that I see church mainly as a vehicle for justice in the world, as a vehicle for bringing God's kingdom to earth, for making earth as it is in heaven. I don't believe that we as Christians are designed to be rescued from this world. I think that any form of theology, any form of evangelism, which uses pictures and analogies that says we are God's chosen people, and one day soon God will come and rescue us from this horrible place. That's the model many people have had. God in this picture is somebody who has come to the shop and he has looked at all the things he wants to purchase, and he has said, I'll have that, I'll have that, I'll have you, I'll have you, I'll have you. And then he's put a deposit down, and now he's left us at the shop, and he's going to come back later and pick us up. And our task then is to make sure that we are dust free, that we don't get cracked and beaten up by use. We must keep ourselves pristine and clean on the shelf. And I think that any picture of church that has that in mind, I think has completely and utterly misunderstood what church is and what our responsibility is in this world. I believe that this is where God designed us to meet together. I believe that God will restore this earth to be the heaven in the future. So he's not going to destroy this earth and then build something new for us to go to, that heaven is a place somewhere else. That God recreates this world in the future and invites us to join him here in this space, and that it is our responsibility now, while we live on earth, to build this earth as if it was heaven. That's the prayer we pray, the Lord's Prayer, to make it on earth as if it was heaven. And most of that, in my opinion, has to do with justice issues. We are supposed to get beaten and broken. We are supposed to walk alongside the sick and the marginalized and the poor. We are supposed to get dusty in this world. We are supposed to incarnate ourselves into the difficult parts of this world, just as Jesus did. So that's where I'm coming from. And if you don't like that at all, you're not going to like much of the next few minutes, because that's the basis on which I've put some notes together. Now, I hope you'll excuse me today. I'm also going to be looking down a little bit at my notes. In Monday's session, I was a lot more polished, and I knew my presentation. I could just speak eye to you. But today I've got a few more notes, because this is a session that I found really tough to put together. I want to thank Andre and the team at Excelsus for inviting me to do this. I've spent weeks thinking about this, and I don't want to miss anything. I don't want to miss any of my points. So with that as the background, that's where I'm coming from. Let me have a look first of all then at the purpose of the church. I think COVID gives us an invitation to reimagine, or if you prefer biblical language, to reform or revive our view of the purpose of the church. As I've already said, I have a real problem when we talk about our church services, the dienst. Who are we serving when we come to church and every Sunday and we get dressed up so that we look nice for each other, we do our hair properly, and then we go off to a church service? Who are we serving, and what is the service we are giving? We spend so much time as pastors and church administrators getting the rosters right. Who's going to do the flowers? Who's going to set up the auditorium? Who's on the worship team? Who's doing the readings? Who's running the youth programs? Who's teaching in Sunday school? I mean, churches are filled with rosters, and is a massive task to fill all of those positions with volunteers, and in larger churches with paid positions. But as a percentage of our time and our effort and our resources, who are we serving? We are serving each other. We've become a country club. And we need to move beyond that. And now you're going to be forced to, because people have had an opportunity in the last 6 months to go and visit some other clubs. And they will have discovered that some of those other churches out there are better than the church that they are at in each of the individual elements. You see, if I'm coming to the church service in order to get something for myself, I want to get some nice worship, I want to get a nice sermon. And those are the main things that people are missing, the worship and the sermon. Well, there's a whole lot of worship available online, and let's be honest, it's probably better than what your church produces. And in fact, Marco Koch pointed this out to me on Monday and asked me this question after Monday's session. He says, how do you deal with the issue that there's a little bit of competition that's emerged now during COVID, because my congregation, even if I put a good sermon together for Sunday, they've got other choices. They can go and listen to Andy Stanley. They can listen to anybody around the world, and they've also got archives. They can go back and look at the best of the best sermons that any preacher has ever preached. So why would they listen to me? Marco, when you asked that question, I suddenly got a little bit of a shock myself. As you know, I was ordained in the Baptist denomination, but I left them many years ago, about 20 years ago, and part of the Methodist Church now, and I am a fully qualified local preacher in the Methodist Church. So I haven't gone back into full-time ministry, but in the Methodist traditions, you go through a process of, I had to do even further theological studies and training, and now I'm certified to preach in the Methodist local churches. And I preach long. You can probably notice that I can speak. and I enjoy theology, and I enjoy presenting, and I preach long. I kind of always aim at about 30 minutes, and I normally hit about 40, 45 minutes. Some of you are thinking, that's not long. I know. But here's why I'm telling you the story, right? Because during COVID lockdown, our little family, and we have a number of people living on our property who are all Christians and all wanted to have church. So every Sunday for the last 6 months, we've gathered together on a Sunday. And sometimes one or other person will preach and tell a story from the scriptures, but quite regularly we've looked online and chosen a sermon. And I'll be very honest with you, I've chosen sermons based on length as well. I don't want to sit on a Sunday afternoon. We have our service at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't want to sit and watch a 45-minute video sermon, as good as it can be. And so I haven't really gone after the Andy Stanley type sermons from his church, although Andy's pretty good. He keeps his things quite short. I've gone for some of the lessons that people like Andy have put together that are 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes at the most. I've suddenly discovered in my own head, I have a different expectation of what I'm going to be looking for when I get back to church. Why should I sit there and sit through a 45-minute lecture that doesn't even use multimedia? A lot of these videos online use a whole lot of multimedia to keep your interest. People are going to come back to our churches and they're going to have a very different expectation of what they are looking for. And the real question, and Marco, this is a great question, why should people come to your church? What is it that is so special about coming, getting up, getting dressed, getting themselves ready, getting to your church and being there. When they realize a lot of what they get at church, they can now get online. I think there are answers to that question. There is something about a live experience. It's kind of like sport, right? You can watch sport on TV, and that's exciting. You can watch live sport on TV, that's even more exciting. But going to the game and experiencing the vibe is part of it. And that's why a lot of young people have moved to bigger churches. That's why a lot of younger people have moved to churches where they can get that vibe. And if the only vibe that you can offer, is an organ played by an old Tani who's kind of quite past her prime, God bless her for her service and all the rest, but it's not a live experience, right? Or the worship team where the guitar's slightly out of tune and the bass guy hasn't really had time to practice this week. Yeah, there is a sense of excellence that we don't get. Now, the people who are involved in the worship team, they maybe love it, but that's different from the experience you're giving people. So that's one reason. I don't think it's a great reason to go to church. And we might need and want to reconsider what we do with that live experience. We might need to realize we don't have to sing 5 songs together. We might need to upgrade our worship experience and say to some people, no, no, you can't do that in worship anymore. We might need to be a little bit more directive about that live experience. Again, I don't think there's a right or wrong here, but I think these are the right questions to ask, even if I'm not sure what the correct answers are. I think the second reason that people come is to get growth as a Christian. Yes, you can read books. Yes, you can watch a video. But the one thing you can't get is you can't get interaction. So this experience of me pre-recording a video for you and then you watching it, okay, maybe you're finding it useful and helpful. And maybe we got some good production values and good content. But aren't some of you just bursting to comment? Aren't some of you just bursting to ask a question? So why don't we have Q&A during our sermons? Why don't we have moments of interaction during our services? Now, sometimes we do this where we allow people to have testimonies, where we allow people to just pray openly. But what about having discussions? What about having conversations? There is nothing in the Bible that says you can't do that. In fact, I think the Bible shows us that that's how it should be. Jesus hardly ever just stood up and lectured at people. He engaged. He answered questions. A lot of what he said was in response to questions. So he gave opportunity for people to ask questions to start with. And that's how he got going. And then, of course, we have that famous line in Mark chapter 4, is it, where it says, Jesus spoke to the crowds. On many occasions, he spoke to the crowds. He never said anything to them without telling a story. And when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything to them. If you're looking for biblical support for models of preaching and ministry, there's your model. Jesus, when he spoke to the crowds on a Sunday morning, he just told parables and stories that would just get people thinking, just sparking their thoughts. And then when he was alone with his disciples, he explained those things to them and had Bible study. We've got it the wrong way around. We come out with sermons that are theological lectures to the crowds. That's not what Scripture models for us. Don't forget that all of the letters in the New Testament were literally that. They were letters that were written to the people, and they gathered the people and they just read the letter out loud. It wasn't a theological lecture. It was a letter that you read, and then that was it. That was the church time that was done. So we need to, I think, really emphasize and focus on the purpose of the church being to grow people in their Christian faith by creating opportunities for people to interact and connect. Now, you might say that's home group, that's Bible study, that's our study times. But why isn't that the thing that we are desperate to get back to? And why couldn't that be the main thing of the church, the focus of the church? Another reason to get together is connection. We again see this in the Bible. Almost always when the early church got together, they got together in people's homes for meals. A lot of what was done in the early church was done around gathering in people's homes with food available. And maybe we need to do that. Again, if we are missing being with each other, then let's not just go back to the church building on a Sunday morning. Let's be together as Christians in community and connection. And then finally, my justice theme again. I think that people get together so that they can do things that they couldn't achieve on their own. And that speaks to me of missions and contribution to society and justice issues. And again, I've been desperately disappointed by many churches and denominations during this COVID period that the church has largely just been silent. That the church has not spoken up about police brutality, has not spoken up about some of the ways in which society has been disrupted. Has not spoken up about racism and gender-based violence. Yes, I know there's the odd formal statement here or there, but the church's voice should be loud right now. And it seems to me, maybe it's just me, but it seems as if we're a little bit silent. And I think that's because we've lost our missional and justice focus. So I think that the answer to the question of why will people come to your church, if you can find an answer that is personal, so it's a real world connection. It's one thing to watch an Andy Stanley video. It's another thing if you know Andy personally and you can sit down and have a lemonade with him and chat. So it's that personal connection. I think it needs to be very local. So there must be a reason that people want to come to church in their community. Big mega churches, I think, where people drive for many, many kilometers, I think are actually going to struggle a little bit after COVID, because I think people want stuff that makes a difference in the community. And I think it has to be real, integrated into our real lives. Now, if we're talking about telling stories, let me throw an illustration in here, an analogy maybe that will help. I think as church, we've got a similar issue to the issue that TV has at the moment. TV adverts, right? Who is still advertising on TV? Because most of us do not watch TV the way we used to watch it 10 or 20 years ago. 10 or 20 years ago, you hardly had any options. I mean, remember when TV first started in 1976, and we had to wait until, 5 o'clock in the afternoon for TV to start, or whatever the time was. and then it finished at a certain time. And you would go to school the next day. That's how old I was back in the 1970s. And you would chat to your friends about, did you see that show? Because you all watched the same show on the same night, and you couldn't record it, and you all watched it at the same time. Today's young people don't have that experience, right? You've got thousands of shows to watch across thousands of different options and different multiple platforms and channels. And it's no good throwing in an advert into any of these things, because people will just skip over the advert, or there aren't any adverts. So you can't just place an advert in between the real stuff that's going on. Take a break after every few minutes or hours of watching TV, and then there's this advert slot. How do people advertise these days? They integrate the advert into the actual show. So when somebody makes a phone call, it's very obvious. You can see that they're phoning on their iPhone. When somebody's typing on their computer, it's very obvious that they're using Microsoft Windows. It's called placement. Is that too far of analogy for you? If all church is a thing that just gets slotted in between the rest of life, you spend 6.5 days getting on with life, then you come in for this little advertising break. A little break from your real life. You come to the sanctuary of the church where you get away from your life. If church is not integrated into your life, I think people will find it very easy to walk away from it. So my first main point is about what is the purpose of church. I think, and this is without trying to give you a theological answer to that question, I think that church needs to be a discipleship-focused community that makes a real difference in the world that you really live in. In other words, in your own community. And I think the emphasis I want to place there is the issue on being discipleship-focused. That it's not about big crowds, it's not about great experiences, it is about helping people to become better Christians. And the people who want to become better Christians know that they need to do that with others. And that when they are with others, they then create a platform on which they can make it on earth as it is in heaven. And I think that this is what we need to be doing. But hey, that's just an ex-Baptist, now Methodist, futurist business consultant, NG Masters theologically trained, white male South African thinks. I don't want to impose that on you, but I do think you should ask the question. And I think that you and your leaders should sit down and really think through what is the real purpose of our church. Which are the elements of our church that absolutely define who we are and what we do? And maybe here's a little practical exercise. Excuse me being a little bit of a business consultant for you. Do this little technique with your leaders. Let's say to them that you are allowed to start church again in October, but you are only allowed to do 5 activities. So of all the different things that your church has ever done, from Sunday school to youth group, from the worship team to church camps, from mission activities to prayer meetings, from fellowship suppers to Bible studies, from baptism and the Lord's Supper, to weddings and funerals and sermons and worship. There's a long list, right? Let's say that legally the government says to you, you're only allowed to choose 5 of those things. which 5 would you choose and why? And maybe in the process of having that conversation, you might discover that there's a whole lot of things, a whole lot of ministries, a whole lot of activities that you're not going to miss at all. Don't just go back to church when you get the opportunity to. Think through what you want your church to be and do in your community. And then whatever you come up with, do that with passion and vigor. Right. Is this useful so far? I hope so. Oh, I wish we could be together so I could see your faces, so we could pause now to have a conversation. So the second thing I want to talk about then is the practice, the orthopraxy, if you like, you want to use a big word. Just what do we do as church? And what do I think the lasting legacy of COVID is going to be? Here I can be a little bit more practical for you, because the first thing is very obvious, right? We are going to be digital churches forever. If you haven't yet gone online, well, you're not going to be at this conference, so let me not even speak to the people who haven't gone online yet. We've all gone online one way or another. Maybe you're doing sermons, maybe, I don't know, maybe you're doing worship, maybe you're not online. Maybe you're putting some resources out, maybe you're doing some devotionals. You've also gone online in your connection with people. So some of you have done counseling with your congregation via WhatsApp, via Zoom. You've done your church meetings via Zoom. So we've moved online, and we will continue to be online. You must be hybrid in the future. So even the stuff you go back and do face to face, you will do some stuff online. Don't forget that the younger a person is, the younger generations in the world, they love online. Now, I'm not saying we should allow them to only be online all of the time, but you need to understand, if you're an older person, if you're older than 40, your default setting is face-to-face meetings. I have this argument with my business clients all the time, especially the financial advisors and the bankers and so on, because they say, we can't do online financial planning. We need face-to-face. And I say, you need face-to-face because you're 46 years old, you're 59 years old. It's built into your system that face-to-face is how you get to know somebody, how you interact with them. But I will tell you for sure that today's young people don't feel that way. I discovered this myself personally as a father about 8 or 9 years ago when we took this photograph. That's my daughter is in the mix there. This is her and some of her friends at school. That's my middle daughter, Hannah. And these girls are actually sending text messages to each other. I knew that they were because I watched them. I was chaperoning as a parent at school, and I was watching the girls. And instead of interacting with their friends as I would have expected them to, here they are sitting on the bench all on their phones. And suddenly all 4 of them burst out laughing at exactly the same time. And I think to myself, what, girls, get a life. Put your phones away and just speak to each other. So I went over it, I did the whole parenting thing, and I said exactly that. And Hannah looked at me and she said, "Oh, Dad, you don't understand." She said, "There are not 4 girls here. There are 7 of us in this conversation. 3 of our friends can't be here this evening, and we want to include them in this conversation. We're sharing jokes and stories. We're sending photographs of what's happening around here so that our 3 friends who are not here can feel included and connected and engaged with us." I'm not sure if those were Hannah's exact words, but that's what she explained to me. And I suddenly realized I know nothing of this. This is not my DNA. This is not how I would engage with the world. But here's the thing, right? For today's young people, the digital world is real. And the real world is digital. They're not two separate things. For me, they're two separate things, and I see them separately. Are we going to have a face-to-face meeting, or are we going to have a virtual meeting? And my daughters and their generation say, well, why can't we have both? Why can't some people meet face-to-face, some people be patching in? This is a generational issue. And what we can do is we can go further than what we've been doing. Let me give you a few ideas. Why don't you host watch parties? Facebook watch parties. So you've been recording your sermons. Not too many people are doing live sermons. And in fact, why are you doing live sermons to a camera? It doesn't make sense. You should pre-record. That allows you to edit. It takes one equation out of the tech equation, pre-record. So hopefully you've been doing that. But there's a better reason to pre-record. You can pre-record your sermon on Sunday. Then you go onto Facebook. You schedule the sermon to only be launched at a certain time, at the time of your service. Then you, as the pastor, you host the group of people who will watch that video together. And while you are watching the video of you preaching, you can chat and interact with everybody who's watching the sermon. So you can both preach and answer questions and interact with people at the same time if you use technology cleverly. And you might be thinking, well, nobody wants to watch the sermon and interact at the same time. Well, hello, old man. Hello, old woman. Young people do, right? Have you ever seen them watching TV? This is how they watch TV. The TV's not here. The TV's up there, but they're on their phone all the time. If they are watching a live football game with their friends, they'll be commenting on the football game at the same time. They'll be taking a selfie of themselves after the goal was scored, yeah, and then posting it, and their friends will be interacting with them. Why can't your church services be like that? Why can't you do that even in a live environment where you provide Wi-Fi in your church building and then encourage a few of your younger people to be involved in real-time conversations during the church service? Why wouldn't you do that? If, remember, we're wanting to have live interactive experiences that help people to grapple and grow with their faith, you can use technology to get that interaction going. It doesn't have to be a distraction. In fact, it can be the opposite. It can help them focus, get deeper, and learn. And then you don't have to even be the one who's done the preaching. You can go online, get a great series of sermons or Bible studies, and you can all watch it together. Another reason for incorporating more digital into our practices is because today's young people, and now I am talking about the middle-aged people, people in their 20s, their 30s, and even into their 40s, are not the same type of people as they were 20 or 30 years ago. 20 or 30 years ago, you could commit to going to a Bible study every Tuesday night. If you said, I want to be involved in teaching Sunday school, you could say, I can sign up for the whole of next year. I will be at church every Sunday morning and I will teach Sunday school every Sunday morning. There are very few 20, 30, 40-year-olds in the world today who have that level of consistency in their lives. We just don't live like that anymore. Our work demands are 24/7. The weekends are not the same. And this is not a COVID conversation. This was true before COVID, but even more so during COVID now. We live a lot more flexible lives with a lot more demands on our time and our flexibility. It's very difficult for someone to sign up for an alpha course, for example, and be there every single week. In fact, if I can talk alpha, this gives me a good opportunity to illustrate just how we don't think about this stuff as a church. I lived in London for a number of years. I actually moved there in 2008 and stayed there with my family for 4 or 5 years. And working in a big city like London, where I lived in Wimbledon, which is on the commuter belt, and you get a train into central London every day, 25 minutes, 30 minutes train in that commute. It's a very different vibe with public transport and so on. And the lifestyle is very different. And so Holy Trinity Brompton, which is an inner city church in central London, said, how can we minister to people and give people insight into the Christian faith? And they came up with this idea of saying, well, instead of everybody rushing out of the office at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening and getting into a packed commuter train and trundling off during rush hour, why don't we give people dinner at church? So we say to people, instead of rushing home, come at 5:30, 6 o'clock, come to our church. We'll give you a free meal. You can sit around, have a meal. We can chat about the Christian faith. There'll be a short little lesson. You can have a conversation with other people. And then, an hour and a half or so later, you can then, having missed rush hour, you can hop on a commuter train, get home. You won't arrive home that much later than you would have arrived anyway. You will have already been fed. You can then spend more time with your family at home. And it works, right? It makes sense in that system. Now, every single other church around the world takes Alpha and says, right, we need to have Alpha, and Alpha has to be a meal. So now we say to people, rush home early from work, get ready for Alpha, get the meal prepared, then come to the church, make sure you get babysitters for the kids and so on. Come and have this meal at the church, and then we keep you longer and take up your whole evening. We're not making your life easier, we're making it harder. We're not slotting into your life, we're asking for a space in your life. And then we wonder why it's difficult for people to commit and to be there every week. Because we haven't understood the different lives that people live. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do Alpha. I'm just saying we shouldn't do Alpha as if we were living in inner city London. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't ask people to commit themselves to being a volunteer, to being a Sunday school teacher, or to being on the worship team. I'm just saying that we have to recognize the realities of the world we live in and realize that people need flexible timing. And so it's been very easy for churches over the last 10, 15 years to say to people, younger people in particular, that those 20, 30, 40 somethings, to say, well, if you can't commit to being here every Sunday, then we don't really want you to be a Sunday school teacher. Then you can't really be a youth group leader. Then you can't really be on the worship team. And we also almost put a bit of shame and guilt onto people because they're not prepared to commit themselves to being inflexible in their commitment to the church when it's impossible for them to do that in the way that they do things. So, digital begins to solve that problem. Because when we get back to traveling for work and people have to travel, when we get back to people needing to go into the office, even now, when people might have to work through an evening or work on a weekend because of work pressures and commitments, the digital connections that we can give people mean that we can have flexibility in our timings. Why does everybody have to watch the sermon at the same time? If it's pre-recorded, you can watch it over the course of the whole day. Why would we all have to get together at exactly the same time to have a conversation about, like a Bible study? Why can't we have a Bible study conversation through WhatsApp? Or on an app like Slack, where you can create channels that people can connect with and engage with. So digital, am I making sense? If all we are thinking is, let's hope that we can finish lockdown as soon as possible and then get back to what we were doing, and if all we're thinking is that we're just going to add a camera in on a Sunday morning and live stream the service, but we're going to go back to services as they were, you are not taking the opportunity that COVID gives you. You are not imagining a revival that's possible to do things in different ways. So that's digital and the practice of digital. But now let's think a little bit further and say, what is it that people are going to really want the church to do? What will celebrations look like? What will consolations look like? Weddings and funerals, things like that. How do we do more than we've done in the past? And digital helps us here because, as I said on Monday, we can include a camera and live stream weddings and funerals. But I think we need to go further than that. We need to show people that we're not just a building that you can come and have a ceremony in, but we want to be connected and engaged in your lives at every level of your life. We want to build community. And community means more than just being in the same space with other people whose faces you recognize. It means building friendships and connections. And there are two types of friendships and connections the church needs to be focusing on. The one is discipleship and mentorship connections. And I think that's fairly obvious, and I've talked about that already. And I think we need to be empowering people to grow in their faith. And for me, my wish more than anything else is that this is what the church gets out of this COVID crisis. That we focus again on building deep, deep, deep into people's lives. That we're not looking at the numbers. We're not looking at how many people we are serving. We're looking at how deep the people are, the maturity of the people who are in our system. And that goes further than just your leaders and so on. Think about parents, right? Another analogy here, homeschooling, right? So now parents have got their kids home and they've got to teach these kids stuff from school, and it's difficult and parents are struggling. Well, how much work have we done in enabling parents to teach their own children about the Bible? Too many parents outsource spiritual education and formation to the church. Just like they outsource education to the school, they see Sunday school as the place their children can come and get spiritual input. Maybe this COVID crisis can unlock us training parents to be discipleship mentor people for their own children. That means developing resources or getting resources and making them available into our congregations. So for me, the first set of connections and relationships is very much around discipleship and mentorship in every format. If youth group is just about entertaining kids on a Friday and keeping them busy, I think we've missed the point. But the second side of connection and relationship is real, genuine friendships. And I think that our churches have been missing deep friendships. Yes, we have fellowship, but do we have real, genuine friendship with the people that we come to church with? And are those friendships spiritual friendships? In other words, we become friends with people we wouldn't have befriended if it hadn't been for Jesus. You see, what I see in the early church, especially in the book of Acts, is I see people being put together who would never have come together. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer male or female. There is no longer slave or free. This was one of the most remarkable things about the early church, is as people looked in from the outside onto this community of people, they said, but why are these people connected to each other? Why are they in each other's houses, eating food together, being friends? Why? They've got nothing in common. There's a master and a slave together in friendship, in fellowship, connection. There's a Jew and a Greek together. In South Africa, do I need to explain how much work we've still got to do to integrate our congregations? It is still a sad truth. Was it Bishop Tutu who said that the church is the most segregated place in South Africa? You know, the most segregated hour in the South African week is Sunday morning, because we have failed to bring racial groups together. Sure, you have the white service in the morning and then the Zulu Xhosa service in the early afternoon. So we minister to people across different racial groups. But have we got people together in a space where, because Jesus compels us, we connect and we see the God image in each other, and we are attracted to that in friendship and connection and relationship? What a picture of what the church should be. And that's a reason to get together again. And we need to find a way to make that a reality. Because that actually, if we can do that, that will solve all of this country's problems, with this underlying racial connection that is missing in our country. So that's not a digital conversation. I've shifted, maybe without alerting you to that shift, into just thinking about what should our churches look like after COVID. And my theme is simple. Don't merely go back to the way you were. Take this opportunity to reform, for a reformation, for a revival, for a reimagination. I want to say two specific things just in this space. And now I might lose some of you, but hey, I'm going to say these anyway. The first is that COVID is actually shining a big spotlight on the role of women in society, isn't it? The people who seem most important during lockdown are teachers, nurses, cleaning staff, a lot of our service staff, and many of these people are women. Sadly, the most important people in society during lockdown also appear to be some of the most underpaid people in relation to their skill sets. And here I'm thinking particularly about teachers, who are fully qualified 3, 4, 5-year professionals, right? Many of them with decades of experience, and are very undervalued. I know you know this because you're pastors. You're also underpaid as well. But the interesting thing is it's a significant group of women who are involved in these very important parts of our world, and very important contribution during a global crisis. And then at the same time, we can also argue that especially mothers, working mothers, have taken the most strain during this time, because they've got to do all of the childcare stuff. I know that many fathers are great fathers and good husbands, but still, working women have much more stress on them than working fathers do. And they've taken strain during lockdown. And I just think that it's a reminder to us that we haven't, over the years, done the best job that we should have done with women in the church. I don't believe that the Bible teaches that women should serve men, not more or less than men should serve women. It's a mutual service, and it's got nothing to do with rank or status. And I believe that women should find themselves in every position in the church. And I think that we should be looking at that, and that COVID should remind us that we've still got a long way to go in raising the profile and status of women in our churches. And if I'm talking about that, and some of you know my reputation, so you were probably expecting this, I also think that we need to be thinking more, and hopefully COVID gives us the impetus to include LGBTQI people in our churches more as well. One of the saddest things that I saw early on during lockdown was a Facebook status from a wonderful Christian man that I know. He's a gay man. And he just wrote, and he said, the most wonderful thing about lockdown, he said on his Facebook page, is that I can go to any church I want to and nobody can turn me away. We find ourselves at a remarkable moment in church history where it's our generation's issue to deal with LGBTQI. Previous generations had to deal with inclusion of women, and generations before that had to deal with slavery. And generations before that had to deal with the Catholic Church and issues around indulgences and purgatory. And generations before that had to deal with the divine right of kings. Our generation has to deal with LGBTQI. And I think, like all those other issues in history, we will discover that God's love calls us for inclusion and affirmation. That there is no Jew or Greek, there is no young and old, there is no slave or free, there is no male or female, there is no gender expression required to find yourself loved by God and called into His church. I won't say more than that now, because I know this is a sensitive topic, and I know that many of your congregations are dealing with this, and I pray that you will continue to deal with it and open yourself up to God's word to us today, which I believe is love. I do believe that love will win this one. But I think that one of the lasting legacies of COVID is going to be the doors of the church opening as we welcome everyone in. All people who have experienced trauma and disconnection and deep emotional issues because of crisis, and that will include the LGBTQI community. Now, having said that, let me finish off now briefly with just my third major point, and that is that there are some theological issues for us to talk about. And again, I'm not the invited theologian to this conference. There are some wonderful theologians that you will hear from. So I'm not going to say too much about this, except to say that if my first point was that COVID gives us an invitation to revive, reform, reimagine our thinking about the purpose of church, if COVID gives us, secondly, an invitation to revive, reform, reimagine what we do, the practices of church, then I also do believe that COVID will give us, thirdly, the opportunity to revive, reform, and reimagine some of our theology. And I think we're going to have a wonderful time. Those of us who are theologians are going to have a wonderful time over the next few years unpacking some of the deep theological issues that are going to emerge. Let me give you 3 examples. I think we're going to change our theology of the church building. You see, there are no church buildings in the Bible. Now, some of you are saying there's a temple. Yeah, but the temple's not a church. And the temple was destroyed specifically. I mean, even at the crucifixion, the curtain is cut, and Jesus says this temple is going to be destroyed, but it isn't going to destroy what you've got. You, the church, do not have a temple. And we mustn't make these monuments to God, these idols. And I think many of our churches have become idols. The only thing we read is that some Christians met early on, for the first few days, they met in the temple. But that was just a place to meet. It wasn't their building. It wasn't their space. It wasn't sacred space. They met mainly in each other's homes. They met in public spaces and sometimes in secret spaces. But they didn't build buildings, and they certainly did not turn their buildings into idols. I've spent most of my ministry years in youth ministry, and I cannot tell you how often the youth are reprimanded. As a youth pastor, as a youth worker, being called in to the leadership of the church and being told that we have messed the church up as youth. That we didn't put the chairs back the way that they should be, that we left some rubbish around, that we left some marks on the carpets. As if the church building was the most important asset that the church had. We know that that's not true. But I think our practice doesn't indicate that. People are desperate to get back to that building. Where they know that the building is not the church, we are the church. So I think there's going to be some conversations around buildings. And I don't think you need a building to be a church. In fact, I know you don't need a building to be a church. In fact, I believe you might be a better church if you didn't have a building. Think about that. Second example is sacraments. Now, for full disclosure, I am a Baptist. I've told you that already, but you know that as Baptists, one of our main principles is the priesthood of all believers. So we don't believe you have to have special training, special certification in order to baptize somebody or do the Lord's Supper or weddings and funerals and the various sacramental things that we do. But I know that many churches have struggled. But how do you do communion if you're at home with your family? And many people are saying, I just want to get back to church so I can have communion again. And then there's been pictures, especially in Catholic churches, of people doing drive-by baptisms of new babies. Where, did you see this? Where the priests are standing with water pistols, spraying holy water. And it's easy for me as a Baptist to laugh at that, but I do think we're going to have conversations about sacraments. Conversations about saying, did we create an idol of the process of delivering the sacraments to people, rather than recognizing what the sacrament should be? Surely you should be able to do communion via Zoom. Why wouldn't you? But that's going to be an interesting conversation, isn't it? And then the third thing, and this brings me full circle and I'm nearly finished, is I think we have to have a conversation about justice. That we have to have a conversation about our contribution to deep societal issues as a church. It is no coincidence for me that one of the biggest societal issues during lockdown has been Black Lives Matter and has been the pushback against racism by society. I say it's no coincidence and no surprise to me because racist issues, Black Lives Matter stuff, people being shot by the American police, racial issues in South Africa, these have been going on for years and years and years. Why suddenly did it burst into a global movement during lockdown? I'll tell you why. because the normal pattern of society was disrupted. And when the normal pattern of society is disrupted, people have an opportunity to step back and analyze what's normal and whether it should be normal or not. We talked about that on Monday as I talked about the lasting legacy of COVID with supply chains and going back to the office and working from home and working from anywhere. Now as we talk about the church, I think it's got to do with societal values. And I think that when people look at how do we treat women, how do we treat black people as white people, how do we treat foreigners, how do we treat the poor, what does it mean that we have millions of people in South Africa that will queue up to get 350 Rand as a government grant that will last them for the whole month? I have no idea how poor the poor people in South Africa are. And all of these things are beginning to emerge in this great spotlight of COVID. And if the church doesn't respond, if the church doesn't have a message for this moment where COVID is highlighting what is wrong and broken with society, if we don't have an answer that makes sense in this world now, then we have nothing to say. For some of you, this is no big deal. You have a theology of justice. You have a theology of societal engagement. You have a missional theology. But sadly, for too many evangelical Christians, for too many Christians, this is still something they have to discover. And I think that we will be having justice conversations as we think about our theology. When you have to paint a wall, if you've got a wall that looks like this at home, the very worst thing that you can do is just take a paintbrush and just paint over that wall. It'll look fine for a little while, and then all of this old paint will show through again very, very quickly. If we want to paint a new wall, we have to scrape the old paint off first. We have an opportunity right now to scrape some of our ingrained habits, some of the stuff we've been doing for years and years, which isn't really church. It's not what church should be. It's not contributing to our mission. We get to scrape off some of the stuff that's causing that politics and those petty squabbles that church can be so full of. We get to scrape off some of the stuff that drains our resources and drains our energy, but we do it just because it's always been done and because the three people who put the most money in the offering plate have wanted it done forever. And their auntie did it before they did it, and you're not allowed to stop it. Except COVID gives you the opportunity to scrape that paint off. Those who choose to relaunch their churches and their ministries with fresh paint, having scraped the old paint off, I think they will do so with a smaller group of more committed, dedicated Christians, and will focus on disciple making and developing first. And maybe they will take their inspiration from the messages that Jesus gives us of pruning. That yes, we must prune and cut things back, just like we did during winter. We cut those rose bushes back and those bushes back. And when the rains come in a few weeks' time, new growth emerges. Maybe we can take those pictures of digging down into deep, fertile soil and allowing the seeds to grow. Maybe the picture now is not of getting more plants, but maybe of making more fertile soil. So whatever you need to do, whatever questions you and your leaders need to ask, I pray And I wish you God's grace and God's wisdom in equal measure. These are tough times. There are going to be tough times ahead. Some churches are not going to survive COVID. Some pastors are not going to survive. This has been tough on all of us. But for those of us who can imagine, not just going back to what we had, but a new, revitalized church emerging out of this crisis that will be remembered forever in history, if we can be part of reforming the church, we will have made a contribution worthy of eternity. And that is my prayer for all of us. May God be with us all. Amen.